The snow came down in curtains, not the gentle postcard kind that children press their faces to windows to watch. This was the other kind, the kind that erased the horizon, that swallowed the road signs whole, that made the town of Crestfall, Montana feel less like a place people lived and more like a place people survived. It was the second week of January. The temperature had not climbed above 12 degrees in 4 days. Main Street was empty. The hardware store had its closed sign turned around before noon. Dolores Pruitt, who ran the diner on the corner of First and Callaway, had sent her 2 part-time girls home at 11 and told them not to come back until the plows ran. The gas station on the edge of town had 1 pump frozen solid and the other throwing sparks when anyone touched it, which no one did. Crestfall had 1,400 residents according to the last census. Felt like fewer now. The kind of cold that settles into a small town in January has a particular quality to it. It isn't just temperature. It's a pressure, a weight behind the ears, behind the eyes. It turns people inward. It makes houses feel like the only real things in the world, and everything outside the window a rumor. So, when people talked about Evelyn Shaw, and they did, quietly, the way people in small towns talk about anything they don't fully understand, it was almost always in the winter. Because in the winter, the distance between her house and theirs felt absolute. She lived up on the ridge on Harlan Road, the old Beaumont property, a 2-story timber frame house with a covered porch that faced south. You could see it from certain spots in town if the weather was clear. Most days it just sat up there, windows dark, smoke from the chimney, the only sign anyone was home at all. She'd moved in 3 years ago, came alone, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, paid cash for the house, and didn't introduce herself to anyone. Not out of hostility, that was the thing people couldn't quite place. She was always polite when she came into town, held doors, said thank you, returned the shopping cart, but she never lingered, never asked questions, never offered anything about herself. Her name was on the mailbox. That was how people knew it. Evelyn Shaw. The general understanding was that her husband had died. Military. That was the rumor. Anyway, pieced together from a conversation someone's cousin had with the woman at the post office, from the single sticker on the back of her truck that had mostly peeled away, leaving only the ghost of a shape that might have been an eagle or a trident or nothing at all. She was 43 years old, though she looked both older and younger depending on the light. Her hair was dark with threads of silver she hadn't bothered to hide. She moved with a kind of deliberateness that people mistook for slowness until they watched her long enough to realize it was something else entirely. Efficiency. Every movement exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger. The hardware store owner, Dale Breckner, had once watched her carry a 100-pound bag of concrete mix from his loading dock to her truck bed in a single motion. No grunt, no strain, like she'd done it 1,000 times. He'd mentioned it to his wife that evening. His wife had said, "She probably has." Children avoided her yard on instinct, the way animals avoid certain clearings in a forest, not because she'd ever been unkind to them, but because something in their nervous systems registered what their parents' polite social filters had trained them to ignore. She always knew where you were before you knew she was there. She always had her back to a wall. She always looked at the exits first. That Tuesday morning, Evelyn came into town for the 2nd time that week. She needed a new propane regulator and 4 cans of black powder lubricant, the kind used on mechanical equipment, though she didn't specify for what. She parked on First Street, 2 wheels up on the snowbank the way everyone did when the plows hadn't come through. She was wearing a wool-lined Carhartt jacket and work boots with the laces double knotted. No hat, though the wind was sharp enough to make the metal stoplight arm at the corner sway. Dale Breckner was behind the counter when she came in. They exchanged the usual 4 sentences. She paid cash. He bagged her order. She said thank you. He said you're welcome. She left. She was almost back to her truck when she heard the vehicles. Not plow trucks, not delivery. The sound was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate, the kind of engine note that came from vehicles modified to perform rather than transport. 3 of them. Coming from the south end of Main Street, moving slow, not sliding the way anyone who'd driven these roads in this weather for any length of time would know to do. They didn't know these roads. Evelyn stood beside her truck and watched them come. 3 black SUVs, late model, government plates that weren't government. The sequence was off by a digit in a way that only someone who'd memorized plate formats would catch. The lead vehicle had a cracked left taillight held together with electrical tape. The windows were tinted past legal limit. She counted the silhouettes. 7, possibly 8. She set her bag in the truck bed, got in the cab, and drove back up Harlan Road. The man who stepped out of the lead SUV first was named Garrett Cole. He was 6'2", 230 pounds, and had the kind of confidence that came from having been the most dangerous person in every room he'd ever walked into. He was 41 years old and had spent 14 of those years doing things in places that didn't appear on maps for organizations that didn't appear on budgets. When those organizations found out what he'd started doing on the side, they'd ended his contract with the kind of efficiency that was meant to be a message. He'd taken the message as a starting point. He stood in the middle of Crestfall's Main Street and looked around with the slow, inventory-taking gaze of a man assessing a location he intended to control. To his right, Marcus Pruitt, ex-military, discharged for reasons that had been sealed. Big through the shoulders, quiet, in a way that was different from Evelyn Shaw's quiet. Hers was still water. His was a held breath. Behind them, 5 others. All armed, all dressed in the kind of civilian tactical clothing that was trying very hard not to look like tactical clothing and failing. Cole had worked with all of them at various points. He trusted none of them past arm's length, and knew they felt the same about him. That was fine. This wasn't a job that required trust. It required compliance and firepower, and he had both. What he needed in Crestfall was specific: a hard drive, 12 terabytes of financial records that connected 11 names to a transaction network that had been running for 6 years. The hard drive was in the possession of a man named Timothy Kraft, who had been a data analyst for one of those organizations and had made the mistake of growing a conscience and the double mistake of hiding in a small town he thought no one knew about. Cole knew about it. He'd known for 9 days. He'd waited for the storm because the storm would cut Crestfall off from outside communication, which would give him the time he needed to do what needed to be done and leave before anyone could report it. He sent 2 men to take down the cell tower repeater on the East Ridge. He sent 1 man to the substation at the edge of town to be ready at the switch. He sent the remaining 4 to begin moving through town, identifying the location of Timothy Kraft's rental house on Birch Street. Cole himself walked Main Street. That was when he saw the woman. She was standing near the corner of Callaway, watching them. Not with fear that was what registered first, because fear was what Cole expected and was practiced at reading. What she had was something else. The same expression a doctor makes when reading an X-ray and finding exactly what they expected to find. "Ma'am," he said, not breaking stride. She didn't move. "Might want to stay inside today," he said. "Road conditions." "Go home," she said. He stopped. The words were flat and quiet, barely audible over the wind. Not aggressive, not a challenge. The way someone says go home to a dog that's wandered into the road. Informational. A warning issued without attachment to whether or not it would be followed. The 2 men walking behind Cole slowed. Cole looked at her for a moment. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who found small things amusing because large things had stopped being interesting. He glanced at Marcus Pruitt. Pruitt made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Move along, lady," Cole said. He started walking again. She didn't move. She watched them pass. And when Cole looked back from 40 yards away, she was still standing there, and she was no longer looking at him. She was looking at the roof of the hardware store, then at the grain elevator, then at the water tower, measuring distances. The thought came and went. He dismissed it. She was a local, probably half crazy from the isolation. They were all like that, these small-town people, after a winter like this. He walked on. Marcus Pruitt glanced back once more. Something moved in the back of his skull, old instinct, the kind that had kept him alive in rooms that smelled like cordite and drywall dust. He'd learned to listen to it once. He'd unlearned that habit sometime in the years since. He kept walking. The house on Harlan Road was exactly what it appeared to be from the outside: practical, maintained, unremarkable. The kind of house that said, "I live here," rather than "look at me." Inside, it was spare. Wood floors, clean. A kitchen with a single set of dishes. A reading chair by the window with a lamp angled precisely overhead. Bookshelves that held reference material, topography, field medicine, mechanical engineering, and no decorative objects. 1 framed photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. A man in his late 30s, dark-haired, standing in front of a mountain range that could have been anywhere. He was smiling in the way people smile when they don't know the photo is being taken. His name had been James Shaw. He had been her husband for 7 years and her closest friend for 3 years before that. He had died 11 months into a deployment she was also on, in a situation that her clearance level still, technically, prohibited her from discussing with anyone outside the chain of command. The chain of command no longer existed in any form she recognized. She had been carrying that prohibition like a stone in a coat pocket ever since. She came in through the back door, hung her jacket, and went to the utility room off the kitchen. Below the second shelf, behind the water heater, There was a floor panel. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It was simply in a place where someone who wasn't looking for it would never look. She lifted it. The case beneath was Pelican, military grade, black, with 4 combination locks. She'd carried this case to 3 continents and 4 deployments. It had survived humidity and extreme cold and one incident involving a vehicle and a riverbank that she did not think about except in the early hours before dawn when thinking was involuntary. She opened it. The rifle was a Mach 13 Mod 7, built to SOCOM specifications and then modified further by a gunsmith in Fort Bragg who had since retired to somewhere in North Carolina and told no one his address. The stock was weather-treated. The optic was a Schmidt and Bender, zeroed to her specific eye relief and hold position. The suppressor technically a sound moderator, a distinction that mattered in conversations she no longer had with people who no longer had authority over her, attached with 2 rotations and a click. She set the rifle on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the secondary contents of the case. 3 loaded magazines, 1 Sig Sauer P 226 with 2 spares, a tourniquet, a radio, handheld, with a frequency preloaded that went to no one now, but which she hadn't changed. A folded piece of paper hand-drawn, her own hand, that showed the topographic layout of Crestfall, its approaches, its high points, its sight lines. She'd drawn it the first week she moved in, not because she expected this, because she'd stopped being capable of not doing it. She took the rifle, the pistol, the magazines, and the map. She put on a second base layer, her outer shell, and a pair of boots with removable ice cleats. She loaded a pack with water, a space blanket, and 2 energy bars, the way you load a pack when you might not be coming back for a while. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking down at the town. 7 of them, possibly 8. 3 entry vehicles. Coordinated. Communication disruption was likely. She'd already noticed the cell signal die 20 minutes ago. They weren't law enforcement. Law enforcement didn't move like that in a storm. Law enforcement announced itself, even when it was trying not to. These men moved like people who were used to not being announced and not being answered for. She knew what they were because she'd worked alongside what they were, and then she'd worked against what they were, and then she'd walked away from both sides of that equation and moved to a ridge in Montana because the only thing left that made sense was distance. She picked up the rifle and went out the back. She was in position on the grain elevator roof by the time the first man separated from the group. The wind was 12 miles per hour, northwest, consistent. Temperature 7 degrees. Visibility 300 yards before the snow blur made precision mathematics instead of observation. She'd calculated for all of it before she'd climbed the access ladder, including the ladder itself, which she'd checked on her way through town 2 weeks ago and found solid. She always checked things like that. The man below was the one they'd sent to scout Birch Street. He was large, moving with the particular ground-covering stride of someone trained in tactical movement, which meant he was also moving with the predictable geometry of that training. He didn't deviate. He went from the corner of Main to the alley between the hardware store and the post office, paused, then started along the back line toward Birch. She watched him through the scope. Not yet. She was tracking, building the picture. He stopped at the corner of Birch and Second, looked at his phone, no signal, which she'd already known, then put it away and went to the 3rd house on the left. Knocked twice, waited, knocked again. She saw the door open. A man in his 30s, slight, wearing glasses, opened it. He had the look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. Timothy Kraft. She knew the name because she'd seen him at the gas station 2 weeks ago and run the face against a habit of attention she'd never been able to turn off. He'd arrived in Crestfall 6 weeks before she noticed him. He'd paid cash for his rental. He'd asked Dolores Pruitt at the diner if there was a good place to send mail without a return address. She'd known then that he was running from something. She hadn't known from what until now. The large man at the door grabbed Kraft by the collar and pulled him out into the snow. That was all she needed. She shifted, breathed out, let the heartbeat pass. The suppressor reduced the report to something that sounded, at distance, like a palm slapped flat against a desk. The wind carried even that away. The large man dropped. He hit the snow at an angle, one arm forward, and lay still. Kraft stared, his mouth opened. She could read lips well enough to know he wasn't forming words, he was forming sounds. Panic before language. She moved. The second position was the water tower platform, 63 yards northwest, elevation advantage of 31 feet over Main Street. She'd pre-positioned there twice in the past month under the cover of checking the town's emergency radio equipment, which she'd volunteered to maintain the previous year, with no explanation for why she knew how. Nobody asked. She was in position in 4 minutes. The snow covered her tracks almost immediately. Cole got the radio communication brief, broken, voice he didn't fully recognize, and then nothing. He tried 3 times. Static. Daniels, he said to the man on his left. Go check on Whitmore. Daniels went. Cole stood in the middle of Main Street, and for the first time in a long time, felt the particular quality of a situation that had changed shape without his permission. He'd operated in environments where variables dropped out. He knew the feeling. He also knew that most of the time it meant nothing. Equipment failure, signal loss, someone had slipped on ice. He waited 3 minutes. Daniels didn't come back. We've got a problem, Marcus Pruitt said from behind him. Cole turned. Pruitt was looking at the rooftops. Not nervously, Pruitt didn't do nervous. He was looking the way a man looks when he's trying to confirm a calculation. 1 shot, Pruitt said. Whitmore, the angle would have to be. He turned, looking back toward the grain elevator, then the water tower. High ground. There's nobody in this town, Cole said. There's somebody on this rooftop. Pruitt pointed at a scrape in the snow on the water tower platform, barely visible, already filling in, and that's a military-grade access pattern. 2-point grip ascent, no heel prints. Cole pulled his radio. Everybody in. Main Street. Now. 3 men came running from different directions. That left 2 unaccounted for. Cole did the math and didn't like what it added up to. She said, go home, one of the men said. He was the youngest of them, a former Army Ranger named Bryce Halton who'd been out 3 years and had been doing this work for 2. He was breathing harder than the cold alone explained. Who? Cole said. The woman on the corner. When we came in, she said. I was there, Cole said. She was measuring the buildings, Halton said. I saw it. I thought he stopped himself. I should have said something. Cole looked at him. What kind of measuring? Range estimation. The way you do it when you're picking a firing position. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was the loudest 4 seconds Cole had experienced in a very long time. Pruitt found the casing. It was on the grain elevator roof, half buried in snow. A .300 Norma Magnum, a round that wasn't sold in any sporting goods store in any town of this size. A round that was used by exactly 2 categories of shooter in the world. Competitive long-range competitors at the elite level, and special operations snipers working at the outer edge of what standard military calibers could do. He picked it up, turned it over. There was a small mark on the base, barely visible, a tool mark from a specific reloading press, the kind that left a signature pattern when the primer was seated. He'd seen that pattern before, not on a casing. On a range qualification sheet, 8 years ago, during a joint readiness exercise that had involved his unit and another unit whose name appeared on no official roster. The unit had sent 2 shooters to the exercise. One was a man named James Shaw, who'd been the best rifle shot Pruitt had ever seen outside of a movie. The other was a woman. He hadn't known her name then. He'd asked afterward and been told it wasn't information that was shared. What he'd been told instead was a comment, offered casually by the range officer, "Don't get down range of her." "Cole," Pruitt said. Cole came to him, looked at the casing, looked at Pruitt's face. "She's not just a sniper," Pruitt said. He paused, working through the probability, the pattern, the math of what he was standing in. The woman, the widow, on the hill. He looked up. Her husband was James Shaw. Cole said nothing. James Shaw was DEVGRU, Pruitt said. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Team 6. He turned the casing over once more. She was his spotter for 4 years, but that's not what she was. What she was, he stopped. They kept it off the books because it was easier. She was the shooter. He was the spotter. "You're telling me..." She was the best on the team. Pruitt set the casing down carefully, the way you set down something breakable. She was the best. On the team. The wind picked up. Snow moved across the rooftop in sheets. Cole looked out across the town, at the empty streets, at the buildings with their dark windows, at the shapes of things that could be anything or nothing. "How many men have we lost?" he said. Pruitt didn't answer. The answer was 4. Cole had 1 card left to play. He didn't like it. He was a man who disliked losing options, and this was the last option, which meant he was already somewhere he'd never intended to be. But he played it because the alternative was waiting in an open street to be addressed by a woman who had already demonstrated that distance and darkness were not obstacles for her. The hostage was Dale Breckner, the hardware store owner. He'd found him in the back of the store, trying to call out on a landline that Cole's man had already cut. Breckner was 57, heavy, frightened, and cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when they've correctly assessed the situation. Cole told him to put on his coat. Breckner put on his coat. He walked Breckner to the center of Main Street. The storm had eased slightly. Visibility was up to 500 yards, maybe more. The sky was the color of old lead. Cole stood behind Breckner and raised his voice. "I know you're out there," he said. "I know what you are. I've known since the grain elevator." He paused. "Come out. We talk." He goes home. Nothing moved. The street was so quiet Cole could hear the snow compressing under his boots. "Last time," he said. She stepped out from the alley between the feed store and the post office. 40 yards, no rifle visible, both hands where he could see them. She was wearing the same jacket she'd had on that morning, same boots. Her face was calm in the specific, trained way that some faces become calm, not the absence of awareness but the presence of so much of it that expression became redundant. "Where's the rifle?" Cole said. "Where I need it," she said. He tightened his grip on Breckner's collar. "I have 3 men left. You come with us. We take what we came for and leave. You go back to your house on the hill and we forget each other." She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that morning on the corner, the X-ray look. "You came for Timothy Kraft," she said. Cole said nothing. He drove into town 6 weeks ago, paid cash, asked Dolores at the diner about anonymous mail. She paused. "I've been watching him since October. Didn't know why until your vehicles came in from the south on roads you'd never driven in weather you didn't understand. You've been watching him." "I've been watching everyone," she said simply. "It's not a decision. It's just what I do." Cole processed that. "You're alone," he said. "You're one person." "You were 8, she said. The number sat between them in the cold air. 4, she said. "Now." Breckner made a sound, not quite a word, just a sound. Cole kept his eyes on her. "I'm going to give you to 3, he said. She didn't move. Nothing. What Cole didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because it required knowing her, was that she'd established the secondary position before she'd come out of the alley. The rifle was not where she'd left it. It was on the roof of the feed store, secured to a bipod she'd anchored to the drainage pipe 40 minutes ago, during the window, when Cole's remaining men were moving toward Main Street and their attention was distributed. The bipod was angled for a specific shot geometry, not at Cole, not at Breckner, but at a point approximately 8 inches to Cole's right, at a height that accounted for the angle of descent from the feed store roof and the slight thermal rise coming off the hardware store's heating exhaust. The trigger was not in her hand. The trigger was connected, via a cable she'd run along the base of the building and under 4 inches of snow, to a toggle mechanism she'd built from parts she'd kept in the second tray of the Pelican case for 11 years. She'd used a version of this system twice before, both times in circumstances that did not appear in any official record. She'd also, 3 hours earlier, while they were still driving into town, moved Timothy Kraft. She'd knocked on his door at 8:30 that morning before the SUVs arrived and told him to take his hard drive and his go bag and go to the root cellar beneath the Lutheran church on 2nd Street, where she'd left 2 days of food and a chemical heater. She'd told him to stay there until he heard the all clear on a frequency she'd written on a piece of paper, using a handheld radio she'd given him from her own kit. He'd looked at her with the expression people use when they can't decide if they're being saved or abducted. "I'm being saved," she said, because she'd read the question in his face before he asked it. "Go." He went. Now she stood in the street in front of Cole and let him count to 3. On 3, 2 things happened at the same time. She dropped flat, deliberate, face down in the snow, and the toggle fired. The shot from the feed store roof was not aimed to kill. It was aimed to disable. The geometry she'd calculated placed the round through the meat of Cole's right forearm, which was his weapon arm, which was the arm controlling both his firearm and his grip on Breckner. The arm jerked back. The grip released. "Move!" she shouted, though Breckner was already moving, was already running, stumbling, falling face first into the snow and scrambling toward the hardware store door on instinct. Cole was down on one knee. His weapon was on the ground, 3 feet from his hand. He was pressing the wound with his other hand and making a sound that had no language in it. The 3 remaining men spun, looking for the shot source, looking at the feed store roof, looking at each other, weapons up and pointing at things that weren't there. She was already moving. Not toward them, around them. She'd come up from the snow, and she was moving along the east side of the street in the shadow line between the storefronts, using the visual chaos of 3 armed men trying to process an attack from above to cover a ground movement that took her to the doorway of the post office in 6 seconds. From there she had the angle she needed. The 3 men were clustered, trying to be tactical but clustered anyway, because humans under stress move toward each other even when training says not to, because somewhere below training there is something older that wants company in the dark. The first round, right shoulder, the man on the left. He spun and sat down. The second round, left thigh, the man in the center. He folded. The third man broke and ran. She let him. He made it to the south end of Main Street and stopped running because his legs wouldn't carry him any further, not from injury, but from the specific exhaustion of a body that has flooded itself with adrenaline and found no use for it. He sat down in the snow with his back against a parked truck and put his hands on top of his head. It took 11 seconds total, from the toggle shot to the last round. She came to the center of the street. Cole was still on one knee, still pressing the wound, still breathing in the deliberate, rhythmic way of a man who has decided that breathing is the thing he is going to do right now and he is going to do it correctly. He looked up at her. She was standing 3 feet away, the cig at low ready, not pointing it at him, just having it. "The hard drive," she said. "Where is it?" He looked at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached inside his jacket with his uninjured hand and removed a waterproof case the size of a paperback book. He set it on the snow. "Crafts," he said. "No," she said. "Yours. The copies you made." He was quiet. "You made copies before you left," she said. "You wouldn't come all this way for someone else's leverage without making copies. There's another drive." He stared at her. "Jacket's other pocket," he said finally. She picked up both. "Set them in the breast pocket of her shell." "Backup's coming," he said. "You understand that. Whatever you think you—" "No," she said. "No backup. You didn't tell anyone where you were going because you didn't want to split the take." She paused. "You've been freelancing for 14 months. Nobody knows you're here." His jaw moved. "I know," she said, "because I've been watching you for 9 days." He blinked. "Since you drove past this town on the highway the first time," she said, running the location, checking sight lines. "I marked your plates. I pulled your pattern." She looked at him steadily. "I know what you are because I know what I am. And I know how men like you move." She stepped back. "The bleeding will slow in a few minutes," she said. "Don't move the arm. Keep the pressure." She looked down at him one more time. "When the road's open, you're going to turn yourself in and tell them everything. You're going to do that because the drives will be with people who know exactly what to do with them, and the only version of the next part of your life that doesn't end in a cell or a ditch is the one where you cooperate." He said nothing. She turned and walked back down Main Street, toward the alley. She did not run. She did not look back. The snow stopped at 4:15 in the afternoon. By 5, the clouds had thinned enough that the last light of a January sun came through at a low angle, turning the snow on Crest Falls Main Street the color of old brass. It was the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph from a time that no longer existed. The Montana State Police arrived at 6:42. 2 units, chains on the tires, having come from Billings on roads that had been technically impassable and were now merely dangerous. The call had come from Dale Breckner, who had found a landline in the back of his store that still had dial tone. Cole's man had cut the exterior junction but missed the interior bypass, a mistake no one who knew the specific routing of Crest Falls' 40-year-old phone infrastructure would have made. What the police found on Main Street: 4 men with non-fatal injuries, 1 man with a shattered right forearm, 1 man sitting against a truck with his hands on his head who had been there for 2.5 hours and appeared almost relieved to see law enforcement. 1 man, the youngest Bryce Halton, had come back on his own, found Breckner in the hardware store, and asked him if he had anything he could wrap his hands around because they'd gone numb. He was sitting at Breckner's counter drinking coffee when the police arrived. 2 men were dead, shot at distances that the responding officer's crime scene training was not specifically designed to process. The first detective from the State Bureau who looked at the patterns stood in the snow for a long moment and then said, quietly, "This is not local." Timothy Kraft was found in the root cellar beneath the Lutheran church, alive, coherent, and extremely willing to talk. The 2 drives were found in a sealed evidence bag on the front desk of the police station, having been delivered no one saw by whom sometime between 5 and 6:30. There was a handwritten note inside. The note said, "Chain of custody matters. Don't lose these." The handwriting was careful, economical, the kind of handwriting that doesn't waste space. She was home before dark. She came in through the back, as always, hung her jacket, unlocked the utility room, opened the case. The rifle went back first. She broke it down in the order she always broke it down: suppressor, optic, magazine, and laid each piece in its foam-lined space. The SIG went in the secondary compartment, the spare magazines. The toggle mechanism, disassembled, wiped clean, each part in its place. She closed the case, set the 4 combination locks, replaced the floor panel. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and put it on the stove. She stood at the window while the water heated. From here, on clear nights, she could see the lights of Main Street below the diner sign, the gas station, the string of Christmas lights Breckner kept up year-round because he said it made the winters feel shorter. The lights were on tonight. She made tea black, no sugar, and carried it to the reading chair by the window. She sat with her boots still on, which she didn't usually do, and looked at the town for a while. She was not thinking about what she'd done. She'd been trained past thinking about what she'd done. That training was one of the things she was most grateful for and most ambivalent about, in the specific way that you're ambivalent about the tools that make you capable of surviving things that should not have to be survived. She was thinking about James. Not about his death. She'd thought about his death enough to understand that no more thinking was going to change anything about it. She was thinking about the way he'd moved through a room the same way she moved, the way they'd learned together, years of it, both of them getting quieter and more deliberate until sometimes they'd sit together in a room for an hour without speaking, and it hadn't been absence. It had been the most present either of them had ever felt with another person. He would have been here if things had gone differently. In this house. In this town. He would have come in from the cold and sat in the other chair, the one that was still empty, that she kept there not out of sentimentality but out of a refusal to pretend the space should be filled with something else, and he would have said something dry and precise about the day, and she would have said something back. And that would have been enough. It had always been enough. She set down the tea, reached up to the mantel without standing, took down the photograph. He was smiling in it. The mountain range behind him, unnamed still, would be unnamed forever, as far as she was concerned. What she saw when she looked at the photograph was not the background. What she saw was that particular smile, the one that he only produced when he thought no one was paying attention. She had been paying attention. She was always paying attention. She held the photograph for a moment. Then she set it back. She looked at the town below. Still protecting them, she said. The words were quiet. Quieter than the wind outside. Quieter almost than thought. She picked up her tea and finished it. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. The cleared sky was filling with stars, the way it did in Montana when the clouds finally moved, not one or two, not a scattering, but all of them. Everything the darkness could hold, spread from ridge to ridge like a map of everything that existed before any of this did, and would exist long after. She turned off the lamp. The house on the ridge went dark. Below, Crestfall's lights stayed on.